April 10, 1943, the pre-dawn darkness over Oro Bay, New Guinea, was split by the roar of Wright Cyclone engines as Major Ralph Cheli pushed the throttles forward on his B-25 Mitchell bomber. Through the oil-streaked plexiglass, he could see 5 more Mitchells forming up behind him, their silhouettes barely visible against the violet sky. The mission briefing had been brutally simple. A Japanese convoy had been spotted steaming south through the Vitiaz Strait, 8 cargo ships protected by 4 destroyers, carrying reinforcements desperately needed by enemy garrisons being hammered by Allied ground forces. Cheli's orders were direct: stop that convoy, but the method would violate every principle of safe bomber operations written in the tactical manuals at Randolph Field. That was the altitude 5th Air Force intelligence estimated would give them the best chance of success. Not 500 feet, not 200 feet, 50 feet above the wave, tops, low enough to taste salt spray on the windscreen, close enough to see the faces of Japanese gunners before the bombs left the racks. The mathematics were unforgiving. At 50 feet, a single moment of inattention, one rogue wave crest, or a brief loss of control would send 6 tons of aircraft and crew cartwheeling into the Bismarck Sea at 230 miles per hour. There would be no recovery, no second chances, no parachutes, just impact and darkness. Yet conventional bombing had failed catastrophically throughout 1942 and early 1943. American bombers attacking from safe altitudes of 8,000 to 10,000 feet watched helplessly as their weapons fell wide of maneuvering vessels, creating impressive geysers of seawater but achieving almost nothing. If you're enjoying this deep dive into the story, hit the subscribe button and let us know in the comments from where in the world you are watching from today. The statistics haunted every squadron commander in the Southwest Pacific. In one convoy interdiction attempt in February 1943, American aircraft flew over 300 sorties and managed to sink only 3 ships while losing 12 bombers to anti-aircraft fire and Japanese fighters. The Japanese were resupplying their New Guinea positions with near impunity, and unless something changed dramatically, the Pacific War would grind on for years, consuming lives at a rate that made even hardened commanders flinch. Lieutenant General George Kenney, commander of 5th Air Force, was not a man who accepted failure gracefully. A fighter pilot from the First World War, Kenney had built a reputation for creative problem-solving that bordered on heresy in the more conservative circles of Army Air Force's headquarters. When his staff officers presented him with bombing effectiveness reports showing hit rates below 5% against moving ships, Kenney didn't blame his pilots or demand more practice. He blamed the doctrine. High-altitude bombing doctrine had been developed in the 1930s when the primary targets were stationary installations, factories, rail yards, fixed positions that couldn't maneuver away from falling bombs. But ships were different. A cargo vessel steaming at 15 knots could travel nearly 500 feet in the time it took a bomb to fall from 10,000 feet. Japanese captains had learned to watch for the glint of sun on wings, the moment bombers rolled into their attack runs, and they would immediately throw their wheels hard over, turning to present the narrowest possible profile. The solution required rethinking everything. If bombers couldn't hit ships from altitude, they would have to attack from so low that ship captains had no time to react. But flying heavy bombers at wavetop height meant entering the kill zone of every anti-aircraft weapon on every vessel in the convoy. 20mm cannons, 40mm guns, even rifle-caliber machine guns became lethal at point-blank range. The risk seemed suicidal. The technique that would change everything had been pioneered in isolated experiments throughout 1942. Major William Benn of the 63rd Bombardment Squadron had successfully employed skip bombing at Rabaul on October 22, 1942, attacking at night and sinking ships by releasing bombs that bounced across the water like stones skipped on a pond. The concept was elegant in its simplicity. If a bomber approached a ship at extremely low altitude and released bombs at high speed with delayed fuses, those bombs would skip across the water surface, bouncing into or under the target vessel before detonating. Benn had proven the tactic worked, but he died on January 18, 1943, when his B-17 disappeared over New Guinea before he could train other units in the technique. His knowledge died with him, and 5th Air Force had to reconstruct the methodology through trial, error, and considerable courage. That responsibility fell to officers like Ralph Cheli, who combined technical competence with the kind of fearlessness that made other pilots simultaneously respect and worry about him. Cheli was 31 years old in April 1943, older than most combat pilots, with a mechanical engineering degree from Rensselaer Polytechnic Institute. He understood aircraft systems with the precision of someone who had actually studied stress loads and aerodynamic principles, rather than just flying by instinct. When Kenney explained the skip bombing concept and asked for volunteers to develop it into a reliable tactic, Cheli stepped forward immediately. The training began in March 1943 using the wreck of the SS Pruth, a British freighter that had been grounded on Natiara Reef in Port Moresby Harbour since December 31, 1923. For weeks, B-25 crews practiced, diving to ultra-low altitude and releasing practice bombs toward the rusting hulk. Each pilot dropped 30 to 40 inert weapons, learning to use a simple reference mark scratched onto their windscreen instead of the complex Norden bomb sight. The learning curve was steep and sometimes fatal. When one crew misjudged their altitude and struck the Pruth's mast, killing all 5 men aboard, the squadron attended the funeral the next morning and resumed training that afternoon. There was no time for extended mourning. Japanese convoys were reaching New Guinea every week, and every ship that arrived meant more enemy troops, more ammunition, more supplies that would cost Allied lives to overcome on the ground. Cheli drove his men relentlessly because he understood what failure meant. Australian and American infantry were locked in brutal jungle warfare against an enemy that had perfected defensive fighting. Japanese soldiers dug spider holes and bunkers that were nearly invisible until you were standing on them. They refused to surrender, fighting to the death even when surrounded and cut off from supply. Every crate of ammunition, every bag of rice, every artillery shell that reached Japanese positions meant more casualties for the men struggling through the rainforest. The only way to stop the supplies was to sink them at sea. By early April 1943, Cheli reported to Kenney that his crews were ready. They had practiced the technique until it became instinctive. Approach at wave-top height, accelerate to maximum speed, align the windscreen reference mark with the target's waterline, release at precisely 300 yards, and pull up hard while your tail gunner raked the enemy deck with 50 caliber fire. The Japanese convoy that departed Rabaul on April 8, 1943, consisted of 8 cargo ships escorted by 4 destroyers. Intelligence intercepts from Allied codebreakers had revealed the convoy's destination, lay, and approximate arrival time. The transports carried approximately 5,000 troops from the Japanese 51st Division, along with artillery pieces, ammunition, food stores, and medical supplies. Protecting them were destroyers with veteran crews who had survived multiple convoy escort missions. Japanese planners believed this convoy would succeed where the March convoy to Leh had been catastrophically destroyed at the Battle of the Bismarck Sea. They had learned from that disaster, implementing new defensive measures. The convoy would travel at night when possible, taking advantage of darkness to avoid detection. Destroyers would maintain aggressive combat air patrols, with Mitsubishi Zero fighters from Rabaul providing top cover during daylight hours. Ships would maintain tight formation, concentrating their anti-aircraft fire to create overlapping fields of fire that would shred any bomber foolish enough to attack at low altitude. Everything had been calculated to ensure success, but Allied intelligence was watching. Reconnaissance flights tracked the convoy from the moment it left Rabaul. On the afternoon of April 9th, a B-24 Liberator on patrol spotted the ships through scattered clouds and radioed coordinates to 5th Air Force headquarters. The information triggered Kenney's carefully prepared plan. Cheli assembled his squadron commanders that evening in a sweltering operations tent at WWII airfield. The briefing was direct. They would launch at 04:30 hours, reach the target area at dawn, and execute coordinated attacks from multiple directions simultaneously. Heavy bombers would strike first from medium altitude to disrupt the convoy's formation. Then the real attack would begin. Modified B-25s, carrying forward-firing machine guns and skip bombs, would come in at masthead height, attacking in elements of 2 or 3 aircraft. Australian Beaufighters armed with cannons would strafe from wave-top level. P-38 Lightning fighters would provide top cover against Japanese Zeros. Everything would happen within a 15-minute window, overwhelming the convoy's defences through sheer violence and coordination. Cheli's orders to his pilots were characteristically blunt. Find your target. Come in fast and low. Use your forward guns to suppress anti-aircraft fire. Skip your bombs into the hull. Get out before the delayed fuses detonate. If you hesitate, if you climb too early, if you release too late, you will die. Questions? There were none. Every pilot in that tent understood what they were volunteering for. At 50 feet above the water, flying at 230 miles per hour directly toward ships bristling with anti-aircraft guns, the margin between success and death was measured in fractions of seconds. One mistake meant your widow received a telegram. But they also understood that if they didn't stop this convoy, American and Australian infantry would pay the price in blood. The modifications to Cheli's B-25 were extensive. Working in primitive maintenance facilities, ground crews had stripped the bombardier position from the aircraft's nose and replaced it with 8 forward-firing 50-caliber Browning machine guns. Additional weapons were mounted along the fuselage sides, giving the bomber a total of 12 heavy machine guns that all fired forward. The result was a flying fortress that could pour devastating, suppressive fire into a target while approaching for a bomb run. The guns served multiple purposes. First, they cleared enemy decks of anti-aircraft gunners. 50-caliber rounds, travelling at 2,900 feet per second, could punch through destroyer hulls, knock out gun positions, and create chaos aboard target vessels. Second, the nose guns allowed the pilot to aim the entire aircraft like a giant weapon. Unlike high-altitude bombing, where a bombardier calculated complex trajectories, this technique required the pilot to fly directly at the target and use his windscreen reference mark as a gun sight. When the mark aligned with the ship's waterline, the co-pilot released the bombs. The approach was brutally direct and demanded absolute precision under conditions of extreme stress. But the modified aircraft were only half the equation. The other half was bombs equipped with special delayed action fuses that would survive water impact without detonating immediately. Standard bombs would explode on contact with the ocean surface, harming nothing except marine life. Skip bombing required weapons that would bounce off the water, carry forward on momentum, slam into or under the target ship, and then detonate after a precisely calculated delay. 5th Air Force Ordnance crews worked with what they had, modifying 500-pound general-purpose bombs with 4 to 5 second delay fuses. The timing was critical. Too short a delay and the bomb would explode while the attacking bomber was still in the blast. Radius, destroying both aircraft and target. Too long, and the weapon might sink before detonating, wasting the attack. 4 to 5 seconds gave pilots just enough time to pass over the target and clear the danger zone before massive underwater explosions ripped through enemy hulls. The physics of skip bombing were unforgiving. Release the bomb too early, and it would skip over the target completely, or lose momentum and sink before reaching the hull. Release too late, and the bomber would be directly above the ship when delayed fuses detonated, killing the crew instantly. Wind, wave height, aircraft speed, altitude, angle of approach, every variable affected the outcome. Pilots learned through repetition, developing an instinctive feel for the precise moment to release that couldn't be taught through classroom instruction. April 10th dawned clear over Oro Bay, perfect visibility for what promised to be a savage engagement. At 04:30 hours, Cheli's B-25 lifted off from Dobadura, followed by 5 more Mitchells from his squadron. Behind them, additional bombers from other units launched in sequence, climbing into the darkness. P-38 fighters took up escort positions, their twin-boom silhouettes distinctive against the lightning sky. The flight to the target area took 90 minutes, cruising at 8,000 feet to conserve fuel. Cheli used the time to run through his mental checklist one more time. Fuel load, sufficient for 2 hours of combat operations plus reserve. Ammunition, 2,400 rounds of 50 caliber, enough for roughly 2 minutes of continuous fire. Bombs, 2 500-pounders with delayed fuses, mounted on external racks. Crew, co-pilot, navigator bombardier, 2 waist gunners, tail gunner, all veterans with combat experience. As they approached the Vitiaz Strait, Cheli could see other elements of the strike force converging. Heavy B-17 flying fortresses from the 43rd Bombardment Group climbed to 12,000 feet, preparing to bomb first and scatter the convoy. Australian Beaufighters dropped to wave-top altitude, their twin engines barely clearing the ocean swells. Everything was coming together with textbook precision, dozens of aircraft from different squadrons coordinating across hundreds of square miles of ocean. At 06:15 hours, reconnaissance aircraft radioed updated coordinates. The Japanese convoy was exactly where Allied intelligence had predicted, steaming southeast through the strait at 12 knots. 8 cargo ships in 2 columns, 4 destroyers positioned at cardinal points around the formation. It was a formidable defensive arrangement, and the Japanese captains undoubtedly believed they were ready for whatever came. They were wrong. At 06:20 hours, the B-17s began their attack runs. Flying at 12,000 feet, they released 1,000-pound bombs that fell toward the convoy in long arcs. The Japanese response was immediate and ferocious. Every destroyer and transport opened fire simultaneously. The sky filled with black bursts of exploding shells. Tracers arced upward in streams of red and orange fire, creating curtains of steel that the B-17s had to penetrate. One transport, later identified as the Kyokusei Maru, took a direct hit amidships. The bomb penetrated through 3 decks before detonating in a cargo hold packed with artillery ammunition. The explosion was catastrophic. The ship's midsection simply disintegrated in a ball of orange flame and black smoke. Metal fragments and burning debris rained down across a quarter-mile radius. The vessel broke in half, both sections remaining afloat for nearly 3 minutes before sliding beneath the waves. But most of the high-altitude bombs missed. Japanese captains executed the defensive maneuvers they had practiced for months, turning hard to port or starboard the moment they saw bombs leave the B-17s. Massive columns of water erupted around the ships, some geysers reaching 200 feet high, drenching decks and temporarily blinding lookouts. Yet 7 cargo ships and all 4 destroyers remained operational, their anti-aircraft guns continuing to hammer the sky. The Japanese captains breathed slightly easier. This was conventional bombing. This they understood. This they could survive. Then the Beaufighters arrived. 13 Royal Australian Air Force Beaufighters came in from the east at wave-top height, skimming across the ocean surface at 320 miles per hour. Japanese gunners, trained to track high-altitude bombers, suddenly found themselves facing targets moving horizontally at impossible speeds. Before defensive coordinators could adjust fire control solutions, the Beaufighters opened up with everything they had. Each aircraft carried 4 20mm Hispano cannons and 6 30-caliber machine guns in the nose, plus additional guns in the dorsal and ventral positions. The combined firepower was devastating. 20mm cannon shells, each the size of a small flashlight, ripped through destroyer superstructures like they were made of cardboard. Machine gun bullets walked across transport ship decks, cutting down sailors and soldiers who had rushed topside to man anti-aircraft positions. If you're enjoying this deep dive into the story, hit the subscribe button and let us know in the comments from where in the world you are watching from today. The lead Beaufighter, piloted by Flight Lieutenant Robert Kirkland, targeted the destroyer Asanagi positioned on the convoy's northern flank. Kirkland came in at 40 feet, so low that his propeller wash created visible disturbances on the ocean surface. At 800 yards, he opened fire. The Hispano cannons roared, sending streams of explosive shells into the destroyer's forward gun mount. The mount disintegrated in a shower of sparks and twisted metal. Secondary explosions rippled along the destroyer's deck as ready ammunition cooked off. Kirkland held his course, finger locked on the trigger, watching his tracers walk from bow to stern. The destroyer's bridge windows shattered. Fire control equipment exploded. Sailors trying to reach their positions were cut down before they could fire a shot. The bowfighter roared over the destroyer's mast with less than 20 feet of clearance, Kirkland's dorsal gunner raking the aft deck as they passed. Behind Kirkland, 12 more bowfighters executed similar attacks, selecting targets with practiced efficiency. The convoy's defensive formation, so carefully organized, began disintegrating under the onslaught. Destroyers, designed to protect cargo ships from torpedo bombers, turned bow on to present smaller targets to the attacking fighters. This maneuver, standard doctrine against torpedo attack, inadvertently exposed the cargo ships they were supposed to protect. Into this chaos came Ralph Cheli and his B-25s. Cheli's formation approached from the southeast at 2,000 feet, giving pilots time to select targets and plan attack runs. Through his oil-streaked windscreen, he could see the entire battle spread out below, ships maneuvering wildly, smoke rising from damaged vessels, tracers creating geometric patterns against the blue Pacific, the Kyokusei Maru sinking stern first, her bow pointing toward the sky like an accusing finger. He selected his target, a large cargo ship, approximately 7,000 tons, steaming hard to port in an attempt to clear the kill zone. Intelligence estimates suggested these transports were carrying troops, ammunition, and heavy equipment. Every one sunk meant fewer enemy soldiers for Allied infantry to face in the jungles. Cheli pushed his control column forward. The B-25 dropped toward the ocean in a controlled dive, airspeed building rapidly. His wingman, Lieutenant James Wheeler, followed close behind, maintaining formation discipline even as they plunged toward the most dangerous altitude in aviation. At 500 feet, Cheli could see individual sailors on the cargo ship's deck, could distinguish officers from enlisted men by their uniforms. At 200 feet, he could read the ship's name painted on the bow, though the characters meant nothing to him. At 100 feet, he leveled out and shoved his throttles to the firewall. The Wright Cyclone engines bellowed, delivering their full 1,300 horsepower. The bomber accelerated to 230 miles per hour, the ocean surface racing past just below his landing gear. At 50 feet, Cheli armed his forward guns and flipped the master switch that would allow his co-pilot to release bombs. The cargo ship grew larger with terrifying speed. He could see anti-aircraft gunners tracking him, could see muzzle flashes as they opened fire. Tracers streaked toward his aircraft, some passing above, some below, a few punching through his wings with sharp, metallic cracks that he felt more than heard over the engine roar. At 1,200 yards, Cheli opened fire. 8 50-caliber machine guns in his nose erupted simultaneously, sending a river of half-inch bullets toward the cargo ship. The effect was catastrophic for anyone caught on deck. Japanese sailors manning anti-aircraft positions were shredded instantly. Gun mounts exploded as armor-piercing rounds penetrated ammunition boxes. The ship's bridge took multiple hits, windows disintegrating in clouds of glass fragments. Cheli held his course with absolute steadiness, his hands locked on the control column despite every instinct screaming to take evasive action. The windscreen reference mark, a simple scratch in the plexiglass that had been calibrated through dozens of practice runs, aligned perfectly with the cargo ship's waterline. At 400 yards, his co-pilot, First Lieutenant Robert Mims, called out ranges. 300 yards, 200, 100. At precisely 300 yards, Mims pressed the bomb release. Two 500-pound bombs with 4-second delayed fuses dropped away from the external racks. The B-25, suddenly 400 pounds lighter, jumped slightly. Cheli compensated instantly, holding his altitude at exactly 50 feet. The bombs fell for less than a second before striking the water surface. The delayed fuses prevented immediate detonation. Instead, the bombs skipped. The first weapon hit the water at a shallow angle, bounced once like a stone thrown by a child, and slammed into the cargo ship's hull at the waterline. The impact was violent enough to dent the steel plating inward. The second bomb followed, hitting water, skipping twice, and disappearing under the ship's hull, lodging against the keel. Cheli pulled back hard on his control column. The B-25 climbed steeply, clearing the cargo ship's mast by less than 30 feet. His waist gunners, Sergeant Thomas Riley and Sergeant Carl Jensen, fired continuously as they passed overhead, their 50 caliber guns raking the cargo ship's deck and superstructure. Spent shell casings cascaded through the aircraft's interior, bouncing off bulkheads with metallic pings. 4 seconds after the bombs hit, while Cheli's B-25 was a quarter-mile away and climbing through 500 feet, the delayed fuses detonated. Twin explosions ripped through the cargo ship simultaneously. The first bomb, lodged against the hull, blew a hole 15 feet in diameter at the waterline. Ocean water rushed into cargo holds with the force of a tidal wave. The second bomb, exploding beneath the keel, broke the ship's back. The vessel's spine, the massive steel keel that ran from bow to stern, snapped like a dry branch. The cargo ship shuddered violently, twisted in the middle, and began settling immediately. Watertight compartments flooded faster than damage control crews could respond. The forward section tilted down at a steep angle while the stern rose, propeller still churning water. Soldiers and sailors poured from hatches, some leaping into the ocean, others scrambling toward life rafts. The ship that had departed Rabaul with confidence just 2 days earlier was dying, and everyone aboard knew it. Behind Cheli, Lieutenant Wheeler executed his own attack with equal precision. He selected a different cargo ship, this one attempting to flee northwest at maximum speed. Wheeler came in from the beam, his approach angle perpendicular to the ship's course, maximizing his target profile. His nose guns cleared the deck of personnel before his bombs skipped perfectly into the vessel's side. One bomb penetrated a cargo hold, the other lodged in the engine room. When both bombs detonated 4 seconds later, the cargo ship's engine room became an inferno. Superheated steam from ruptured boilers killed every man in the compartment instantly. The explosions severed fuel lines, and burning diesel oil spread through adjacent compartments. Within 90 seconds, the entire aft section was engulfed in flames. The crew abandoned ship, and the vessel capsized 12 minutes later, rolling onto its starboard side before sinking stern first. All around the convoy, B-25s were executing near-perfect attacks. The technique that had been tested through countless practice runs against the wreck of the SS Pruth was working flawlessly under actual combat conditions. Captain Edward Morrison attacked a transport from the bow, putting both bombs into the ship's forward cargo holds. The explosions detonated ammunition stored below decks, and the resulting secondary blast blew the ship's bow completely off. The vessel sank in less than 4 minutes. Lieutenant Kenneth Bradford targeted one of the destroyers, the Murasame, that was attempting to position itself between attacking bombers and the cargo ships. Bradford came in at 40 feet, even lower than doctrine recommended, his propeller wash creating a rooster, tail of spray behind his aircraft. His forward guns hammered the destroyer's superstructure, killing the fire control officer and destroying radar equipment. His bombs skipped with textbook precision, one striking the destroyer amidships, the other passing underneath the hull. The underwater explosion lifted the Murasame bodily out of the water. When the destroyer crashed back down, its keel was fractured, internal bulkheads buckled, and flooding began in multiple compartments. The vessel maintained way for another 20 minutes, its crew frantically working pumps, but the damage was too extensive. The destroyer settled gradually lower in the water, before finally rolling onto its port side and sinking at 07:10 hours. If you find this story engaging, please take a moment to subscribe and enable notifications. It helps us continue producing in-depth content like this. The Japanese response, hampered by the sheer speed and violence of the attack, became increasingly desperate. Anti-aircraft gunners found themselves engaging targets that were upon them before they could properly aim. The 50 caliber suppression fire from approaching B-25s made it nearly suicidal to remain at exposed gun positions. Sailors who tried to fight back were cut down by streams of bullets that could punch through light armor and destroy weapon mounts. The skip bombing technique itself proved nearly impossible to defend against. Unlike high-altitude bombs that could be evaded through maneuvering, these weapons came in so fast and so low that evasion was impossible. By the time a lookout spotted an incoming B-25, the bomber had already released its weapons. Captains watched helplessly as bombs skipped across the water directly toward their ships, striking hulls with tremendous force, before delayed fuses sent high explosives tearing through vital compartments. Above the low-level carnage, P-38 Lightning fighters engaged Japanese Zero fighters that had arrived from Rabaul to protect the convoy. The air battle was fierce but brief. American pilots, flying aircraft superior to the Zero in speed, firepower, and structural strength, shot down enemy planes with methodical efficiency. Flight Officer Richard Bong, who would later become America's highest-scoring ace with 40 confirmed kills, personally shot down 3 Zeros in less than 7 minutes. 2 P-38s were lost in the engagement. Both pilots killed when their aircraft were hit by Japanese fire and exploded. But their sacrifice ensured that bombers could continue their attacks without interference from enemy fighters. The few Zeros that did break through to attack the B-25s found the bombers' defensive firepower formidable. Waist gunners and tail gunners on American aircraft fired back with 50-caliber weapons that could tear a Zero's lightweight airframe apart. Several Japanese fighters went down to bomber defensive fire. By 0650 hours, just 30 minutes after the attack began, 6 of the 8 cargo ships had been hit, and most were sinking or ablaze. 2 of the 4 destroyers were badly damaged or already going under. The water of the Vitiaz Strait was filled with debris, oil slicks, and Japanese sailors abandoning ship. Above the devastation, American and Australian air crews struggled to process what they were witnessing. The technique they had practiced for weeks had exceeded every expectation. Ralph Cheli, circling at 3,000 feet to assess damage and coordinate follow-up attacks, counted burning ships through his binoculars. 6 transports confirmed hit, 2 destroyers damaged or sinking. The convoy that had departed Rabaul with such confidence was being systematically destroyed. He felt no particular triumph, just a grim satisfaction that the mission was succeeding. Every ship sent to the bottom meant fewer enemy soldiers his country's infantry would face. But the battle was not finished. 2 cargo ships, though damaged, were still making way, attempting to reach the relative safety of shallow water near the New Guinea coast, where they might beach themselves and salvage at least some of their cargo. One destroyer, the Akizuki, though hit by strafing runs, remained combat effective and was laying down heavy anti-aircraft fire to cover the surviving transport's retreat. Cheli made his decision instantly. He reformed his squadron for a second attack run. His fuel gauge showed 30 minutes of combat endurance remaining. His ammunition counters indicated he had perhaps 40 seconds of firing time left. It would have to be enough. He dove toward the fleeing cargo ships, his wingmen following without hesitation. They had trained for this. They had survived the first attack. They would finish what they started. The second wave of attacks repeated the morning's devastating pattern. B-25s executed precision low-altitude runs, while P-38s kept Japanese fighters at bay. Cheli personally attacked one of the fleeing cargo ships, coming in from dead astern where the vessel's anti-aircraft coverage was weakest. His nose guns raked the ship's superstructure, destroying the bridge and killing the captain. His bombs skipped perfectly, both weapons striking the hull near the waterline. When the delayed fuses detonated, the cargo ship's fate was sealed. Massive holes below the waterline flooded 3 cargo holds simultaneously. The vessel listed heavily to starboard, its deck angle increasing with each passing second. The crew abandoned ship in good order, launching life rafts and helping wounded into the water. The ship capsized completely at 07:25 hours and sank 10 minutes later. Lieutenant Wheeler attacked the last cargo ship, hitting it with both bombs amidships. The explosions detonated fuel tanks, and burning oil spread across the water around the sinking vessel. Japanese survivors swimming away from the ship found themselves surrounded by flames, and many died from burns or smoke inhalation before rescue could arrive. The transport sank at 0740 hours, its bow rising vertically from the water before it slid beneath the surface, with a sound witnesses described as a vast metallic groan. The destroyer Akizuki, though damaged, fought to the end. Its captain, Commander Nakamura Eiji, refused to abandon his post even when it became clear the convoy was destroyed. He ordered his gunners to continue firing at attacking aircraft, personally directing fire control from the bridge even after shrapnel from a bowfighter's cannon fire had wounded him in the shoulder and chest. The Akizuki shot down one B-25, killing all 6 crew members, before multiple skip-bombing attacks finally overwhelmed the vessel's damage control capabilities. The destroyer settled gradually, listing to port as flooding spread through compartments. Commander Nakamura ordered his crew to abandon ship at 0800 hours, but he remained on the bridge as his vessel sank beneath him. Japanese survivors later reported that Nakamura was last seen standing at attention on the bridge wing as water rose past his waist. He went down with his ship, and his body was never recovered. By 08:15 hours, the battle was over. 8 Japanese cargo ships had been sent to the bottom of the Vitiaz Strait. 3 destroyers were sunk or sinking. Only one destroyer, the Suzukaze, managed to escape, though heavily damaged and with casualties exceeding 40% of its crew. The destroyer limped back to Rabaul at reduced speed, arriving 36 hours later with its deck crowded with survivors pulled from the water. The human cost of the engagement was staggering. Of the approximately 5,000 Japanese troops who had departed Rabaul bound for Leh, fewer than 800 made it ashore. Another 1,200 were rescued by the Suzukaze and by submarines dispatched from Rabaul for search and rescue operations. Approximately 3,000 Japanese soldiers and sailors were killed, either going down with their ships or drowning in the oil-slicked waters of the Vitiaz Strait. For the Allies, the losses were remarkably light given the intensity of the combat. 19 American and Australian aircrew members were killed. 12 died when their aircraft were shot down in combat. 7 perished when a damaged B-25 attempting to return to base crashed on landing at Dobodura. 23 airmen were wounded, some seriously. 6 aircraft were lost in combat, 2 P-38s, 3 B-25s, and 1 bowfighter. Against 8 Japanese ships sunk and thousands of enemy troops killed, the exchange rate was almost inconceivable. If you're enjoying this deep dive into the story, hit the subscribe button and let us know in the comments from where in the world you are watching from today.